Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. I'm Eloise McLennan. I am the Deep Dive magazine editor, and I'm here with our editor-in-chief, Jonah Comstock, who is fresh from San Francisco, where he has been attending the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. Jonah, hello and welcome.
Hey, Eloise. Thanks for jumping on to chat with me. It's a Friday morning, and I got in Thursday night, so very fresh.
And you just about made it to JP Morgan. There was a snowstorm, so thankfully we were able to get you across the country and down on the ground with all of our expert insiders and hear really from the ground as to what's going to be going on in healthcare in 2024. So I think if we start quite broadly, what were the key takeaways that you saw from this year's event?
I think I spent the first 2 days of the 3 that I was there lamenting the fact that I hadn't heard a lot of consensus on what the key takeaways are, but they started to crystallize eventually. I think the big thing is that the whole industry got thrown a bit of a curveball. A couple weeks ago when I was doing interviews for my end of the year, my 2024 prediction pieces, people were saying they were kind of skeptical about what this year was going to be like from an investment and deal-making perspective. And then over the course of 3 weeks, right around Christmas, a whole lot of big pharma, multi-billion-dollar acquisitions dropped. So everyone sort of had to recalibrate and say, "Oh, maybe this is going to be a good year for acquisitions." And that was the prevailing mood was this optimism, but with a little asterisk of, is this just recency bias? Because there's a lot of factors contributing in both directions. But overall, the sense was that because of patent cliffs, because of the IRA, pharma companies are looking to M&A to shore up their pipelines, to diversify and gird against uncertainty. And they have the capital, and the economy is improving, so they're feeling good about spending it. So most people seem to be anticipating kind of an uptick in deals, especially late stage clinical or almost clinical assets that are largely de-risked and can kind of slot into the pipeline without too much work and without too much risk or uncertainty. So that was the big takeaway.
A bit of a return to form with the movement towards more deals, but with a hint of caution. So we're not just going to go head first like we did in 2021 when we had that big investment bubble.
Yeah, I mean, the last 2 years have been, kind of rough from a funding perspective. I mean, and a deal-making perspective, they've been obviously really exciting years for innovation. And so now it's like these big strides have been made in R&D. And there's lots of biotechs doing really exciting things. So, let's see if we can get a piece of that.
And while we may not have expected quite as many big deals going into JP Morgan this year, one thing that we could not have underestimated would have been AI. So what was the vibe towards AI on the floor? And was there anything that you weren't expecting to hear around that kind of technology?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big topic of conversation, but in a different way than I'm accustomed to it being a big topic of conversation at these events, because there was a lot of specificity in the way people were talking about AI. I think the age of just saying we use AI or we have AI and expecting that to be a differentiator or turn heads is long over. And everyone understands AI well enough in broad strokes that they know what questions to ask next. And mostly those are questions about data. The thing that separates healthcare AI use cases from consumer AI use cases is the fact that, the data sets are very siloed. They're, they can be poor quality depending on what you're trying to use them for. There are privacy issues, access issues. So the AI winners in healthcare are going to be the data winners, the people who have good proprietary data or are doing the work on public data sets to make them useful. And that is kind of the golden ticket, because the algorithms are table stakes. I mean, yes, still, it's not nothing to build a model and an algorithm, and a lot of people are extracting value that way. But the thing about generative AI and ChatGPT is everybody's a coder, and that is going to keep getting better. So the data, I think, as a long-term differentiator, people are really worrying and thinking about the data. And the other thing about AI is just the multitude of use cases. We're well beyond the low-hanging fruit. Some of the low-hanging fruit did not turn out to be that easy to pick anyway. So there's still a lot of conversation about how best to leverage AI for something like drug discovery or target selection. But there's all of these places where AI can improve manual processes and see big returns. So there's a huge opportunity to just innovate everything. A lot, I think, especially around clinical trials is one of the big areas where we see that. Even something as simple as having ChatGPT do the first pass on your protocol design, or or translating your informed consent into the local language if you're doing a trial in Japan. Things like that. People were saying operational things that you might not think about, but when you put them all together and you have a machine that can just do them, it really makes a difference.
Even just something that scans your emails to make sure there are no glaring errors when you're sending things to patients or something like that. It makes such a big difference to the way that your operations run.
The only caution is that ChatGPT's problems are magnified in healthcare. And so there is a lot of, we really don't want to be hallucinating here. We don't want to trust an AI to take us down a very expensive drug development route and turn out to have been making something up. We don't want, to end up communicating to patients and accidentally, saying something we don't mean. So there's, in addition to kind of getting this good data, there's also some work being done to sort of see what, the bias and the hallucination problems. Can we correct those for healthcare, or can we build human safeguards into the processes around the AI to make sure that those don't cause problems?
I think we should probably clarify there that it is the AI that creates hallucinations, and it's not the person who is using the AI who is having hallucinations.
No, hallucination is just it's a term to art for the phenomenon of ChatGPT and its ilk making things up. These models are very confidently wrong, and that concerns a lot of people because we're going to come to rely on them very quickly.
Especially when we talk about data, there is the old adage that data and numbers don't lie. And when you know that we have things like hallucinations within AI programs, that is going to be a huge problem if you blindly trust the data that is being presented to you. So that's
true.
Is that something that you heard at all on the floor?
No, I think everybody takes that very seriously.
I should hope so.
In a sense, there is also a problem of not enough trust, which that's a misleading way to say it, but a lot of these things can't reach their full potential until the industry in general really trusts them, and especially regulators. So there's a lot of eyes on the FDA and and its counterparts in Europe and in Asian countries, around the world, to say we can do this with trials and with real world evidence, but no one's going to do it until they trust that the AI is going to accept those trial results the same way they would a randomized control trial. I should put in just a quick plug here, and there's a little more about this in my column, and maybe I'll write a full piece on it or do a full podcast on it later, but just had a fascinating conversation over lunch with the folks from Komodo Health and a guy, Tracy Main, who works with them. And he's with Slipstream IT. It was all about synthetic controls, and the big takeaway was that not only can we do certain trials with synthetic data, so instead of actually having a control group, pulling a control group from existing patient data, but we're kind of going to have to start doing that because there is a growing problem with these post-market trials for accelerated approval drugs where nobody wants to be on a clinical trial for something that they could actually be prescribed, because nobody wants a 50% chance of a life-saving drug when they could have a 100% chance of getting it. And it's really affecting the trials. I mean, they're in the one sense, they're kind of functionally unblinded because the effects of the drugs are so obvious that people know whether they're on them or not. And then when people find out they're not, they just leave the trial, which corrupts the data. So there, this is potentially, it's already a real problem, but it's only going to become a bigger problem because the FDA is pretty doubled down on accelerated approvals. So if they don't also figure out how to run the confirmatory studies, in a robust way, then they really have a problem. And there's not really another good option except for leveraging synthetic data. So that's a situation where, the tools are there. I mean, it's pretty impressive what can be done with synthetic data. And it's been going on for a few years. But the bottleneck is, do we trust that the regulators trust the data? It's like these layers of trust.
Yeah, like a parfait. Is that the Shrek quote? Like a parfait of trust. Lots of layers, or an onion.
And I mean, it makes sense when you think about it because it's really expensive to run a trial, even with synthetic data. And you don't want to be the first one to do anything novel in a trial because, if the FDA turns out doesn't accept it, then you're really in trouble.
Risk versus reward with innovation, really, isn't it?
Yeah. But I mean, one thing that's been very interesting to me kind of in a broad sense as I've become more engrossed in this field is that there's like a second order problem of innovating the way we innovate, like it's one thing to study an innovative drug using an R&D process that regulators are familiar with, because then you can kind of prove, yes, this works or no, this doesn't work. But when you're trying to innovate the R&D process at the same time, you're trying to premiere a new digital biomarker for studying Alzheimer's. Well, now there's noise because are we seeing the effect of the biomarker or are we seeing the effect of, of the intervention? And so it's hard to get that stuff off the ground because you don't have it's hard to get funding to just trials. And I think that's one thing that's held back, hybrid and digitized clinical trials for a long time. Is this kind of first mover problem and this, measuring the measuring problem. But there's a lot of people working really hard on all the pieces of that. And so it's a matter of time. But given the speed that technology is advancing, you finally get something accepted and you're kind of moving on to the next thing. So,
well, that's very encouraging. So just moving back a little bit to JP Morgan, because I think we're starting to do the whole full podcast. We need to save something for another day. What presentations did you see that really caught your eye? Aside from synthetic drug arms over lunch and the topic of AI, what else caught your eye?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I should just mention one specific example of AI. As I was able to go to a demo event for NVIDIA, the chip maker, which has launched a platform that basically uses kind of Gen AI interface for drug discovery. And it's pretty impressive how sort of easily you can be like, tell me what these targets are and now tell me which ones do this and do that. And it, leverages available data. So that was pretty cool. They're pretty well invested in the space. And it was interesting to see their CEO kind of who's very much a tech guy, the extent to which he's really kind of gotten himself in the weeds on this stuff, really learning to understand it. But in terms outside of AI, the innovations that people were talking about really were a lot of talk about cell and gene therapy, which is not surprising given we had the two big gene therapy approvals just about a month before the conference started. The talk there is not too different than what it has been. It's just a matter of a feeling that progress is being made. So one of the big problems in cell and gene now is that, the innovation is about to explode, the approvals are about to explode, and the business models and the infrastructure aren't necessarily there. These are completely different drugs than what we're used to. A lot of them are one-time cures, so they have to be priced very differently, very expensively, but ultimately generating a value, over the lifetime of the patient. They right now, when we are talking about autologous cell therapies, which is a lot of them, they have to be, you have to go to the patient, you have to take their cells out of their body, you have to do gene editing on them, and then you've got to put them back in. And that's a very expertise-intensive process.
You make it sound very
simple. It's anything but. And so, it's not just we need a supply chain for a drug. It's we need, to stand up operations with trained people and specialized equipment that can do this all over the country and the world. And that's a pretty tall order too. So, but I say, so these are the problems, but it does feel like, there's progress being made. And, Peter Marks at the FDA spent his whole talk talking about the ways that the FDA is going to try to be encouraging innovation in gene therapy and get more approvals. I saw the CEO of Bluebird Bio, who's one of the companies that had a gene therapy approved last month. And he was talking on stage about their pricing decisions and how they're really getting the payers to come on board by going at risk and offering an outcome-based model, which is value-based care, something we've been talking about for years and seen, few enough real examples of. So there's a sense, this might finally move the needle on that kind of risk-sharing arrangement for pricing, because there's just no other way to do this with these life-changing therapies. And then
it's interesting to hear you bring in regulators and payers, because if I remember back to Frontiers Health, one of the key takeaways that we heard from people is that regulators and payers should be a big part of these congresses where you can work together. Was that something that you saw reflected at JP Morgan as well, the need to really increase those collaborations?
Yeah, definitely people. I think pharma in general, and this is not exactly the same thing as you're talking about, but I think there's a related mindset shift here where, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, really took pharma companies by surprise. And, it was kind of a wake-up call that, not that they were being adversarial with governments and regulators before, but it really, drove home how important it is to be working with governments and have a kind of productive, collaborative relationship, because you really don't want to get in a fight. And the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission that regulates mergers and acquisitions in the United States, has sort of been signaling that it's going to be looking closely at pharma mergers, and those are the bread and butter of the business of pharma. So, it's like bring those people to the table, figure out what the concerns are, figure out how we can work together. With the FDA, I think industry's been much better at working with the FDA for a long time, but it's always a work in progress. One thing I heard a few times is that the FDA is not a monolithic organization. In some ways, it's like it's more like a hydra. There's many different departments, and they don't necessarily have the same feelings about specific technologies and how and to what extent they should be regulated. So it's important to kind of keep an eye on all the guidances that come out and be as involved in the conversation as you can. And I think that's really, if people didn't know that before, they're kind of realizing it. It's just hit home lately. We have to work with regulators,
especially as we're coming through with so many innovations. And you said that idea of understanding, and that there may not be certain processes in place for you to explore this innovative way of doing things. Working together where you can actually help regulators to understand what you're trying to do, so that you don't come across what we've seen with AI in particular, where regulators are having to play catch up almost with the technology and the advancement of the technology.
Yeah. And another thing the FDA has been doing is really good is they've been hiring a lot, and they've been hiring from the industry. So they do have those experts on staff who know what they're talking about. and understand the way the industry is thinking about things. I wanted to say the other thing from a R&D perspective, and this will be in my column too, is antibody drug conjugates. They never went away, obviously. Hugely successful, real success stories of the last few years at ASCO, but there's a lot of, they're very, very popular acquisition targets. They were last year. They look like they're going to be again this year. Syneos Health did a Dealmakers survey that showed that ADCs were the technology that acquirers were the most excited about. I saw a talk by Daiichi Sankyo's CEO where he talked about how the company has really completely restructured itself to focus on ADCs because they believe, so strongly in the opportunity and in how much more opportunity there is. So cell and gene, I think people get excited about because it is, in some ways the new kid on the block, and it has, these incredible results for patients. I mean, curing things that we previously had sort of resigned ourselves to just treating for the rest of a patient's life. That's a huge paradigm shift. So it makes sense that people are excited about cell and gene, but ADCs are also, hugely effective. I mean, they have effect sizes that sort of make people do a double take at these conferences like ASCO. And there's still a lot of work that can be done there, and that's still a strong focus of the industry. So a lot of talk about ADCs, a lot of, excitement about that. Like, just because it's not as like hypey at this point as AI or cell and gene, it's still a huge kind of growth area with a lot of potential to help a lot of patients.
I think in one piece I read of yours, you called it the third act. And I think that perfectly kind of describes it, whereas AI and cell and gene are maybe act 1, act 2, where it's very much the hype. We're in the end game. Well, maybe not the end game, but moving close to it when it comes to ADCs, especially after the success of drugs like Enhertu.
Yeah, originally I had written second act because, and I was riffing off something that Ken Keller, the CEO of Daiichi Sankyo, said. That, he said, we're just getting to the end of the first chapter of ADCs. It just took us 100 years to get through that chapter. But I thought maybe it is the third because, who knows? This is all very subjective. But, the first being sort of like the discovery of this technology and then a long period of time of trying to make it work without having a lot of like real successes. And then the second being, having Enhertu and seeing the big success, and then, and that kind of initial excitement about that. And then the third being like, okay, now let's buckle down and see how much work this can do.
Almost like the first act is the idea, the second act is the prototype, and the third act is the one you sell.
Yeah, but it is interesting to note that with antibodies, there was a long period of time between sort of the realization that this might work and like actually getting this to work. And so that's, and then that's science for you. But
that's science for you. I think that should be the new tagline for JP Morgan Health conferences.
Well, I mean, CRISPR is kind of, the similar thing there where like, you remember everyone was excited about CRISPR like 5 years ago. And by everyone, I mean like, the lay people, like it won the Nobel Prize and there were big, Time magazine articles about it, what it can do. And then, we went back to the lab to actually work on doing it. And we just saw the first CRISPR-derived therapy approved in December. So, these things do take time. And the hype cycles, I think, are different than in tech, where it's like, oh, here's this new thing. You can get it in August,
And speaking of tech, one thing that I did read from JP Morgan is that big tech was making quite a big impact. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes. Yes and no. There were several big announcements. Google, Alphabet spin out, made some big announcements. So the Alphabet spin out, Isomorphic Labs signed some big deals with Eli Lilly and Novartis for AI drug discovery. NVIDIA, I mentioned, they're working with Recursion and Amgen on some of these these platforms are also for drug discovery. And then Amazon, a little bit of a different kind of announcement. They announced that they're working with Omada Health, which is a long-term digital therapeutics company in the chronic disease management space. And that's pretty significant because Amazon's healthcare efforts have really been sort of a stepwise march. Now we're doing prescriptions. Now we're going to add in telehealth for, acute conditions. And so if they're really getting into the chronic condition space, it's a pretty big shift for them. And then there was one more Alphabet spin-out that had a smaller acquisition. So a lot of movement from big tech, and not just like, oh, we're at a conference, so let's make an announcement movement, right? Like pretty significant investment. And what I wrote in my column was that, I worked for Moby Health News before I came to Pharma Forum, and I spent a long time covering sort of big tech's forays into healthcare. And they have been, mixed results. Some real big failures. I mentioned Haven in the column, Google Health.
Theranos!
Yeah. And I think what tech has learned is that tech and healthcare, and especially tech and pharma, are really, really different worlds. And trying to come in and say, we're going to do this now, and we're going to do it better than you did, like they maybe did to taxis or stores, is just not the approach that's going to work in healthcare. It's got to be, hey, we think we can help you do what you do better with our technology and our approach to innovation, but we need your expertise. So it's working with, instead of, trying to own these markets. And again, I mean, these are very broad strokes things. Certainly, this has been understood for a long time by some people, but that's the shift. I think the large scale shift I'm seeing is like big tech has figured out that this is the way to make an impact, is to really partner.
I think I completely agree with that. The biggest partnership I've seen is big tech coming in saying, hey, we understand data. And then pharma companies going, we understand how the regulatory system works. We understand that you're not going to be able to just create something and it can hit the ground running. There is a way of doing things that will work for us. So I think you're absolutely right. I've seen so many more partnerships rather than one or the other trying to innovate individually.
Yeah, and it's good to see. I mean, the other thing about big tech is obviously the conference is in San Francisco, so there's going to be a little more, I don't want to say bias, but like they're right there, right? They can come make an appearance.
Okie dokie. I think we've run out of time for this podcast. We've done half an hour now. Are there any big takeaways that you would like to emphasize from your time at JP Morgan?
It was a good show. I did a whole lot of video interviews, and they're going to be trickling out over the next month and a half. And I think what you're going to see in those is a lot more deep dives on, particular companies and technologies. I spoke to mostly small biotechs, a lot of which are in one way or another in gene therapy. There are definitely other areas on the sort of edge of, the innovation bubble that I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about in years to come. I think that microbiome is an area that has been very slowly creeping up from kind of novelty to, hey, there's real gains to be made here. It's been rocky road for psychedelics, and I didn't hear much about them here, but I think that's also something that we might start to see. We didn't talk at all about GLP-1s. It might be worth diving into that for just a quick second.
Go for it.
I didn't hear as much GLP-1 conversation as I expected to, frankly, and that could have just been the meetings I happened to be in. There's a certain amount of luck there because it's such a huge conference. But what I am hearing is, the pharma company heads that I heard interviewed, when they were asked about GLP-1s, if they weren't already in the space. The answer is kind of like, yeah, this is a huge thing, a huge transformational technology that nobody saw coming. But we're still not that interested in being the third, Me Too here. They want to see, like, how do we take it forward? How can we have a version that's, better than what's out there? And of course, the companies that are already making these drugs are also, they're hoping to get ahead on that. So formulation is a thing. Like the possibilities for GLP-1 in a pill rather than an injection could make a big difference for how accessible it is. And then really the downstream effects on, not just obesity, but everything cardiometabolic. What's the safe and responsible and effective way to leverage this technology, preventatively around heart disease? That's a big question. And then the other thing is there are some kind of worries about exactly how GLPs work in terms of, like, metabolically, fat and muscle, and so there's some optimization that can maybe be done on their effectiveness in terms of in patients who maybe have less severe obesity.
And I think that leads me quite well into my last question for you today, which is, apart from GLP-1s, was there anything else that you didn't see that you were expecting to, or that you were slightly disappointed that you didn't see?
No, not disappointed. I guess, like, it is, I think I would, die if I did more than 3 days of JP Morgan, but at the same time, like, at the end of 3 days, you don't feel like you've seen enough sometimes, because there are so many different really exciting things going on in pharma, and you'd like to be able to hear a little bit about all of them. I would note, there was a panel at one of the events I was at about women's health, and the moderator said that they do this panel every year, and it was towards the end of the day on Wednesday. Normally there's almost nobody there in the room, and the room was really packed, and a lot of that panel was talking about some of the difficulties of getting funding in women's health and how sort of ridiculous they are. But just the interest there was sort of encouraging that this is starting to be taken more seriously as a space. So that might be something I think we'll hopefully hear more about in the next few years, and hopefully, like, a more frothy deal-making environment will be good for that space. But at the same time, if the deal-making is focused on these sort of late-stage things, then I'm trying to think. It's a really good question. I'll tell you one thing I was very happy to not hear more about was the IRA. At JP Morgan 2023, you couldn't walk into a room without hearing somebody lament the IRA and its effect on their business. And I don't mean to minimize that. I mean, I think pharma has some very real concerns about the way the legislation is going to affect their pipelines, but the sky is falling stuff was a lot, and it certainly seems that now that they've accepted that it's not going away, people are much more talking about, like, here's how we're going to deal with it, here's how we're going to move forward, and it's almost like there was a concerted effort to talk about it last year, because they were still kind of playing the PR game, lawsuit as press release. Like, let's really try to get the public on our side about how hard this is going to be for innovation. And that, we're past that now. It's here. It's happening. We're going to try to minimize the effect and, try to figure out how we can move forward and make drugs for patients.
Which is the ultimate, it's what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't mean to say that it's over and we're never going to hear anything else about the IRA. We certainly are, but I think the general attitude is one of, like, it's time to figure out where we go from here.
So the conversation is changing more than the topic.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for joining me today, Jonah. It's been great hearing about what you saw and heard on the floor at JP Morgan Week. If you want to hear more or read more about what Jonah saw, you can read the live coverage that we had from the event, which you can find on the Pharma Forum website. As Jonah has mentioned, there is also going to be an opinion piece that is coming out and potentially a roundup. And you will also be able to find some of our coverage in the upcoming Deep Dive magazine in February. So keep your eyes peeled for that.
Yep, and a shout out to our news editor, Phil Taylor, and our web editor, Nicole Raleigh, who really stayed on top of covering the big news stories out of the show remotely from Europe. We also, if you go to the news section on Pharma Forum, you can see all these acquisitions and tech announcements and things like that. Thank you, Eloise. Always a pleasure to sit down and talk pharma.
Okay.
That concludes this episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series at pharmaforum.com/podcast. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for Pharma Forum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at PharmaForum. Thanks for listening.